On September 28, 1840, Pastor Louis Edward Nowlow of Gravois Settlement in Missouri wrote a letter to a small number of other German ministers who had come from the Evangelical Church in Prussia to serve churches in the United States. The letter read, "For some time, a number of us have felt in their solitude and isolation the need for fellowship and fraternal cooperation. We propose, if God wills, to hold a gathering. A covenant of fraternal fellowship will be made." The isolation that these frontier pastors felt was heightened and charged by strident debates among religious adherents in that part of the Midwest at the time, and a general grab for which Christian sects might dominate the landscape out there. The rationalists sparred with the pietists, and the newly immigrating Lutherans vied for number of adherents from the Reformed folk who had been already in the country for about a century and were in the process of expanding westward. Today is the first of 5 sermons on the history of the United Church of Christ, our denomination. Now, in New England, we are rightfully very, very proud of our congregational roots, so am I, but the UCC is strong and made stronger by many strands that came together and were woven together to become what is now our United Church of Christ. Today I am talking about the German Evangelical Church Society, as it was first called, made up of immigrants who arrived in the United States the first half of the 1800s and who settled in Missouri and its surrounds. The pastors came from the Basel and Barmen missionary societies of Switzerland and Germany. Now, these missionary societies in the old country were formed outside the structure of religious sects, and they were centers of pietism. Pietism was an alternative to the more structured approach of much of the Reformation. Now, that part, the Reformed tradition, spent a lot of time debating narrow distinctions. Pietism did not want to get involved in those debates. It also eschewed German rationalism. Pietists believed that following Jesus was less about what one was to know or believe, and more about how one was supposed to behave. Pietism focused on the life of the faithful individual rather than the structure of the church as a whole or correct theology. So they shifted the emphasis from the workings of a congregation as a whole to the experience of the individual standing before God. Faith, they held, was primarily a practice, and worship was supposed to be an open prayer experience. The holy word of unity, as we heard in today's scripture passage from that letter to the church of Ephesus, was paramount, and the pietists felt that disputes were no good way to arrive at truth. And I quote from one Philip Jacob Spener here, "Human minds are filled as much by fleshly as spiritual zeal, which makes disputation fruitless." Now, these missionary organizations in the Old Country, Basel and Barmen, supported missionaries, initially thinking they would send them to the East and to Africa, but soon recognized a need to supply ministers to the newly expanding American frontier, where thousands of Germans and German-speaking individuals were immigrating. In particular, the Basel Society partnered with a missionary society in Hartford, Connecticut, to assess the needs for leadership on the expanding frontier and supply it in ways that were friendly. This is what the Hartford's organization wanted to supply leadership in ways that were friendly to the congregational tradition. So as you can see, right from the get-go, there was already some partnership between this evangelical German group of folks and our congregational tradition. The pastors that received that letter that I began my sermon with came through these missionary societies and all shared that pietistic heritage and a desire to remain non-sectarian. And so they organized themselves from the first into a Kirchenverein, a church society, avoiding the more formal language of synod in order not to be a threat to all the other organizations out there. Furthermore, they decided there should be a parity between lay and clergy, and that the distinction between lay and clergy should be minimized. Again, this occurred long before our Congregationalist tradition decided that lay people should participate in shaping theological identity. By the way, if any of these characteristics sound familiar to you, our minister emeritus, Charles Whiston's father was a professor at Eden Theological Seminary, the seminary that was founded by this branch of our denomination in 1850. And Reverend Charlie grew up in a church called Evangelical United Church of Christ of Webster Grove. Now, doesn't this sound like us? We're the South Congregational Church of Kennebunkport, South Congregational Church. Then we add the United Church of Christ. But just like we have so much pride in our congregational heritage, out there they had pride and still do in their evangelical heritage. Through this branch, we are also related to two theological giants of the 20th century, Richard and Reinhold Niebuhr. Richard, both of them, by the way, attended Elmhurst College and Eden Seminary, the schools of the evangelical branch. Richard was a theologian of the church and framed one of the most lasting analyses of how the church should relate to culture. In a book called Christ and Culture, he frames 5 options for the way a church could relate to culture. First is Christ against culture. Christ of culture is second. Third, Christ above culture. Fourth, Christ and culture in paradox. And fifth, Christ transforming culture. And you can hear in this last one, which is the one that he favors, this idea that people living the life of faith appropriately would affect the whole culture. So you can hear the pietistic roots right there. Reinhold Niebuhr, his brother, is considered a public theologian, ethicist, and public intellectual, and is one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. Much of his work was given the term Christian realism, though he himself disliked that nomenclature. And he was monumental in framing a theological justification for our engagement in the Second World War. He navigated between what he saw as the naivete of liberals and the social gospel movement that he felt did not account for the complexity of human nature, and the religious conservatives whose view of Scripture he felt lacked complexity and whose narrow definition of true religion failed to follow the wideness of Jesus' mercy. Again, you can hear in that the evangelical impulse towards a wide embrace. His work has influenced political thought and people as diverse as Hillary Clinton, Madeleine Albright, John McCain, James Comey, and Barack Obama have named him as a significant intellectual influence. By the way, we not only have Richard and Reinhold, they also had a sister, Hulda Niebuhr, who became a professor of Christian education, serving at several seminaries. Taking Ephesians 4:3, part of today's scripture, as their motto, evangelicals strove to live by the quote on the front of our order of worship: in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity. By essentials, they meant spiritual experience, the lived experience of God's saving power. Doctrine, they felt, was helpful, even important, but non-essential. Faith was lived then as a trust. Now that you've heard a little bit about the German Evangelical Church Society, what can we name in the United Church of Christ as our strengths that they brought to us, to our common life? First, this parity between laity and clergy in the church, so that all of our decisions in our denomination are made by an equal number of clergy and laity. That keeps our decision-making as too important for the church professionals. It needs to be held by all of us. Second, the evangelical branch brought something to soften that stridency of argumentation and debate that comes from two branches of the United Church of Christ, namely the Reformed tradition, we'll hear about that next week, and the Congregational tradition. I hate to tell you that, but we are argumentative in the Congregational tradition. The Reformed branch softened that for us and teaches us to see that there are so many differences which are not essential, and that we can approach with Christian charity. Third, I would name that this pietistic approach comes to us and informs us to live our lives in a way that is faithful, rather than paying so much attention to theological correctness. That tradition, by the way, in the evangelical side, gave birth to many deaconess societies, these non-clergy organizations that started hospitals and other charitable organizations. So the idea that people living their faith could change the world and offer hospitality and ministry to the whole was essential to the evangelical side and has informed our common life as well. And so we learn and take away that we too can have these gifts. We too can keep in balance laity and clergy. We too can soften the stridency of our voices and live in a trust that the essentials are what we need to focus on and the rest can be let go. And we too can center our religious life in common on a prayerful approach that pays attention to life lived faithfully in a way that our individual lives demonstrate God's presence to us. May we uphold these beautiful values in our common life.